What if every time you closed your eyes, you experienced your own death in vivid, horrifying detail? What if these weren't nightmares, but glimpses into something far more sinister? Tonight, I'm going to tell you about Marcus Thorne, a man whose dreams became his prison, and whose nights transformed into a countdown to madness. This is a story that psychiatrists refuse to discuss publicly, a case that was buried in medical archives for over 30 years. The details I'm about to share come from leaked hospital records, personal journals, and the testimony of those brave enough to speak about what they witnessed. Marcus Thorne was 28 years old when it started. A software engineer living in Portland, Oregon, he was the kind of man you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Average height, brown hair, the type who preferred books to parties and code to conversation. But in March of 1993, something changed inside Marcus's mind. Something that would transform him from an ordinary man into one of the most disturbing psychological cases in modern history. It began with a simple nightmare. Marcus found himself standing on the edge of a cliff, wind howling around him. In the dream, he felt a hand push against his back, sending him tumbling into the void below. He experienced every second of the fall, the terror, the impact, the moment his life left his body. Then he woke up, drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged animal desperate to escape. Most people would dismiss this as stress, maybe too much caffeine before bed. But Marcus knew something was different. The dream felt more real than reality itself. He could still taste the metallic temps of fear on his tongue, still feel the phantom pain where his body had shattered against the rocks below. The next night brought another death. This time, he drowned in a bathtub that wasn't his own, in a house he'd never seen before. The water filled his lungs as invisible hands held him beneath the surface. He experienced the panic, the burning sensation as water replaced air. The final moments when consciousness faded to black. Again, he woke up screaming. By the third night, Marcus was afraid to sleep. But exhaustion is a cruel master, and when sleep finally claimed him, he died again. Stabbed 17 times in an alley behind a restaurant he'd never visited. Each wound bringing fresh agony until his life ebbed away onto the cold pavement. What made these dreams truly terrifying wasn't just their vividness, but their consistency. Marcus began keeping a journal, documenting every detail. The dreams always followed the same pattern. He would find himself in an unfamiliar location, experience a brief moment of confusion, then die in some brutal fashion. Sometimes it was murder, sometimes accident, sometimes suicide that he couldn't control. But he always died, and he always experienced every excruciating moment leading to that death. After 2 weeks of nightly deaths, Marcus sought help from Dr. Elena Vasquez, a sleep specialist at Oregon Health and Science University. Dr. Vasquez had seen patients with recurring nightmares before, but nothing quite like this. Marcus didn't just dream about death. He lived it with an accuracy that defied explanation. During their first session, Marcus described a dream where he'd been hit by a red pickup truck while crossing a street in downtown Seattle. He could recall the license plate number, the crack in the windshield, even the song playing on the radio in a nearby coffee shop. Dr. Vasquez was skeptical until she decided to investigate. The street Marcus described existed, down to the specific intersection where he claimed to have died. The coffee shop he mentioned was real, located exactly where he said it would be, but it was what happened next that truly unnerved Dr. Vasquez. 3 days after Marcus described this dream, she received a call from Seattle police. A man had been killed by a red pickup truck at that exact intersection. The license plate number matched Marcus's description perfectly. Dr. Vasquez convinced herself it was coincidence. But as Marcus continued his nightly journey through death, more coincidences piled up. A house fire he dreamed about occurred 2 days later in the exact location he described. A drowning in a lake he'd never visited happened within the week, matching his dream down to the smallest detail. The victims were always strangers, people Marcus had never met, but their deaths played out exactly as he had experienced them in his sleep. By the 6th week, Marcus looked like a ghost of his former self. Dark circles ringed his eyes. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and he'd lost over 20 pounds. He'd stopped going to work, stopped eating regular meals, stopped living any semblance of a normal life. His entire existence revolved around the terror of sleep and the deaths that waited for him there. Dr. Vasquez tried every treatment available: sleep medication, therapy, even experimental procedures that had shown promise with other patients. Nothing worked. If anything, the drugs made the dreams more vivid, more intense. Marcus began to describe details that seemed impossible for a dreaming mind to fabricate. The exact temperature of water when he drowned, the specific chemical taste of poison when he was murdered by arsenic, the precise angle of bullets when he was shot. During one particularly disturbing session, Marcus described a dream where he'd been tortured in a basement for hours before finally dying. He provided details about the room: concrete walls painted yellow, a furnace in the northeast corner with a specific brand name, a small window at ground level that looked out onto a garden with red roses. Dr. Vasquez felt compelled to investigate, and what she found shook her to her core. The basement Marcus described was discovered 3 days later during a police raid in suburban Portland. Every detail matched perfectly: the yellow walls, the furnace, even the garden with red roses visible through the small window. Inside that basement, police found evidence of multiple torture sessions and murders dating back several years. The killer had never been caught, and there was no way Marcus could have known about this location through normal means. As word of Marcus's case spread quietly through medical circles, other experts became involved. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neuroscientist from Stanford, flew to Portland to study Marcus's brain activity during sleep. What she discovered challenged everything science understood about dreams and consciousness. During his death dreams, Marcus's brain showed activity patterns unlike anything Dr. Chen had ever seen. Instead of the typical REM sleep signatures, his brain displayed patterns that resembled someone actually experiencing trauma. His pain centers lit up as if he were genuinely being injured. His body showed physical stress responses that matched real torture victims she'd studied. It was as if his mind was actually connecting to these distant deaths, experiencing them as if they were happening to him. Dr. Chen theorized that Marcus might be experiencing a form of consciousness transfer, somehow tapping into the final moments of dying people across the country. She had no explanation for how this could be possible, but the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus wasn't just dreaming about death, he was experiencing actual deaths as they happened to real people. The breakthrough came during Marcus's 9th week of nightly deaths. He dreamed of dying in a car accident on Interstate 5 near Salem, Oregon. A drunk driver had crossed the median and struck his vehicle head-on. Marcus described the exact mile marker, the time of the accident, even the song playing on the radio, but this time was different. This time, the accident hadn't happened yet. Dr. Vasquez faced an impossible decision. If Marcus's visions were real, she could potentially save a life by calling the police. If she was wrong, she'd destroy her career and reputation. But as she listened to Marcus describe the accident in terrifying detail, noting the fear in the victim's eyes during those final moments, she made her choice. She called the Oregon State Police and reported a potential accident at the location Marcus had described. The officer who took the call was skeptical but agreed to send a patrol car to the area. At exactly the time Marcus had predicted, police spotted a drunk driver weaving across lanes near the mile marker he'd specified. They pulled the driver over before any accident could occur. The potential victim was a 42-year-old teacher named Jennifer Walsh. Driving home from her daughter's piano recital, she had no idea how close she'd come to death, how her final moments had been experienced by a stranger in Portland, who'd never met her but had lived through her death in vivid detail. This incident changed everything. Dr. Vasquez realized that Marcus wasn't just experiencing random deaths, he was connected to future victims, experiencing their deaths before they happened. Each night, he was living through someone's final moments, seeing through their eyes as life left their body. But this revelation brought new horrors. If Marcus was experiencing future deaths, that meant he was helpless to prevent most of them. He could only watch, trapped in dying minds, as murder, accident, and tragedy played out in real time. The psychological toll was devastating. Marcus began to break down completely. He would wake from his death dreams, sobbing, not just from his own trauma, but from grief for the strangers whose deaths he'd shared. He knew their final thoughts, their last moments of hope or despair, their dying wishes that would never be fulfilled. He carried the emotional weight of dozens of deaths, each one adding to his psychological burden. Dr. Vasquez tried to convince Marcus to help prevent more deaths, to use his terrible gift to save lives. But Marcus refused. He'd already tried calling police about deaths he'd witnessed, but most didn't believe him, and those who did investigate usually arrived too late. The deaths he experienced were already set in motion, unchangeable forces, heading toward their tragic conclusions. By his 12th week of nightly deaths, Marcus had stopped eating altogether. He survived on water and the occasional piece of bread, his body wasting away as his mind was consumed by the deaths of others. Dr. Vasquez arranged for him to be hospitalized, but even there, surrounded by medical professionals, the dreams continued. Hospital staff reported that Marcus would wake up screaming at all hours, calling out names of people he'd never met, describing locations he'd never visited. He would thrash violently during his dreams, his body acting out the death throes of his victims. Restraints became necessary, not to keep him in bed, but to prevent him from injuring himself during these episodes. Dr. Chen continued her research, documenting brain activity that defied scientific explanation. During one particularly intense session, Marcus's brain showed activity in regions that should have been dormant, almost as if he was accessing memories or experiences that weren't his own. The implications were staggering, suggesting consciousness might be far more complex and interconnected than anyone had previously imagined. As Marcus deteriorated further, strange things began happening around him. Electronics would malfunction in his presence. Lights would flicker when he experienced particularly violent deaths. Security cameras in his hospital room would capture strange shadows and movements that couldn't be explained. It was as if his connection to death was creating ripples in reality itself. The medical team brought in specialists from across the country, neurologists, psychiatrists, even physicists who specialized in consciousness research. None could explain Marcus's condition or offer effective treatment. He was a medical anomaly, a man whose mind had somehow become a conduit for death itself. In his 14th week, Marcus experienced what would be his most horrifying death yet. He found himself in the body of a child, no more than 8 years old, trapped in a basement while a predator approached. The death was slow, agonizing, and filled with terror that no adult mind should ever have to process. When Marcus woke from this dream, something inside him had broken irreparably. Dr. Vasquez found him the next morning, sitting in his hospital bed, staring at the wall with empty eyes. He wouldn't speak, wouldn't respond to questions, wouldn't even acknowledge her presence. It was as if the accumulated trauma of experiencing so many deaths had finally shattered his psyche completely. For 3 days, Marcus remained in this catatonic state. Then, on the 4th night, something changed. Instead of his usual screaming and thrashing, Marcus lay perfectly still during what should have been his death dream. Monitors showed his brain activity had shifted to a pattern none of the doctors had seen before, almost as if he'd found a way to shield himself from the experiences. When he awoke that morning, Marcus seemed different, calmer, but somehow more distant, as if part of him had retreated to a place where the deaths couldn't reach. He spoke for the first time in days, but his words chilled everyone who heard them. "I'm not experiencing their deaths anymore," he said quietly. "I'm experiencing my own. Every night, I die a little more, and eventually, there won't be enough of me left to wake up." Dr. Vasquez didn't understand what he meant until the pattern became clear. Marcus's death dreams had changed. Instead of experiencing the deaths of strangers, he was now living through different versions of his own death, night after night. Car accidents where he was the victim, murders where he was the target. Suicides he couldn't prevent himself from committing. Each death was different. But the victim was always Marcus himself. The medical team theorized that his mind had finally found a way to disconnect from external deaths by turning inward. But this new pattern was even more destructive. Marcus was slowly killing himself in his sleep, experiencing his own death. So many times that the line between dream and reality was completely erased. His physical condition deteriorated rapidly. Each morning he would wake up with new injuries that matched his dream deaths. Bruises where he'd been beaten, marks on his throat where he'd been strangled, even small cuts that corresponded to stab wounds from his dreams. His body was manifesting the trauma his mind experienced during sleep. Dr. Chen documented these physical changes with growing alarm. Marcus's body was responding to dream trauma as if it were real, a phenomenon that shouldn't have been medically possible. Blood tests showed stress hormones at levels typically seen in torture victims. His heart showed signs of damage consistent with multiple cardiac arrests. His brain scans revealed patterns similar to those seen in patients who'd experienced severe head trauma. As Marcus entered his 16th week of nightly deaths, he made a final request. He asked Dr. Vasquez to document his story to ensure that what had happened to him would be recorded somewhere, even if it was never believed. He spoke of feeling pulled toward something, a final death that would end the cycle forever. "I can feel it coming," he told her during their last conversation. "The final one. The death I won't wake up from. It's been waiting for me all along. And I think I'm ready to go." That night, Marcus died peacefully in his sleep. Hospital monitors showed normal brain activity throughout the night. No signs of the violent episodes that had plagued him for months. When morning came and he didn't wake up, staff found him lying peacefully in his bed, a slight smile on his face for the first time in weeks. The autopsy revealed nothing unusual. No signs of disease, no injuries, no explanation for his death. Marcus Thorne had simply died in his sleep, his body finally succumbing to months of trauma that medical science couldn't fully understand or explain. Dr. Vasquez sealed Marcus's case files and buried them in the hospital archives. The other doctors involved in his treatment agreed never to speak publicly about what they'd witnessed. The implications of Marcus's case were too disturbing, too far beyond current scientific understanding to be released to the public. But the story doesn't end there. In the months following Marcus's death, several of the medical professionals who'd worked with him began experiencing unusual dreams. Dr. Vasquez reported nightmares where she experienced deaths from other people's perspectives. Dr. Chen found herself waking up with knowledge of accidents that happened days later in distant cities. It was as if Marcus's connection to death had somehow spread to those who'd tried to help him, creating a network of people who carried pieces of his terrible gift. They formed an informal support group, meeting secretly to discuss their experiences and try to understand what they'd been exposed to. The group discovered that Marcus's case wasn't entirely unique. Throughout history, there had been scattered reports of people who claimed to experience the deaths of others through dreams or visions. These cases were typically dismissed as mental illness or fraud. But the group began to wonder if they represented something more, evidence of a level of consciousness that science had yet to acknowledge. They theorized that Marcus had somehow tapped into what they called the Death Network, a hypothetical connection between all conscious beings at the moment of death. According to their theory, dying minds release a final burst of consciousness that some sensitive individuals can accidentally access, experiencing those final moments as if they were their own. Marcus's tragedy was that he'd become too connected to this network, unable to filter out the constant stream of death experiences that bombarded his sleeping mind. His brain had become a receiver tuned to humanity's final moments, picking up signals of death from across vast distances. The group continues to meet, documenting similar cases and researching the boundaries of human consciousness. They've identified several other individuals who show signs of death sensitivity, though none as extreme as Marcus's case. They work quietly, knowing that their research would be dismissed by mainstream science. but driven by the need to understand what they witnessed. Dr. Vasquez keeps Marcus's journal in a locked drawer in her office. Sometimes, late at night, she reads his descriptions of the deaths he experienced, trying to understand the mind of a man who carried the final moments of dozens of strangers. His words reveal not just horror, but profound empathy for the people whose deaths he shared. A man who mourned for victims he'd never met, but whose last moments he'd experienced intimately. The final entry in Marcus's journal, written the day before his death, offers a glimpse into his state of mind during those final hours. I used to think death was the end, the cessation of everything we are. But I've learned it's more like a doorway, and some of us are standing too close to the threshold. I've seen what waits on the other side, felt the peace that comes when the pain finally stops. Tomorrow night, I think I'll finally be allowed to walk through that doorway myself. Marcus Thorne died as he had lived his final months, experiencing death with an intensity that few humans could comprehend. But unlike the violent, traumatic deaths that had plagued his dreams, his own death was peaceful, as if he'd finally found the rest that had been denied to him for so long. The man who saw his life, and every night, had finally found an ending of his own, leaving behind only questions about the nature of consciousness, death, and the mysterious connections that might bind us all together in ways we're only beginning to understand. His story remains buried in medical archives, a case too strange for public consumption, too disturbing for comfortable discussion. But for those who knew Marcus, who witnessed his suffering and documented his experiences, his legacy lives on as a reminder that human consciousness might be far more complex and far more interconnected than we dare to imagine. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, remember Marcus Thorne and the price he paid for seeing beyond the veil that separates life from death. And if you find yourself dreaming of places you've never been, experiencing moments that don't belong to you, perhaps you'll understand that consciousness is a far stranger thing than we've ever been willing to admit. Sweet dreams.